Hey everybody, welcome back to the Jodo cast. I'm Joe. Kurt's with me here today, and you've already noticed we have very special guest Will Shick from Atomic Mass Games
Hello.
joining us. If you don't mind, because it might be changing or it has changed since the last time I looked it up, would you please give everybody your definitive title over at Atomic Mass Games? What is your Who
Sure.
are you? Tell
Who am
everyone
I?
what's your deal?
Who am I? My
What are you
mom and
doing
the
here?
authorities have been trying to figure that out. Yeah, so I'm Will Shick. I'm the director of product development for Atomic Mass Games, which effectively means that in my role, I oversee all of the creative product creation process. So, game development, sculpting, art, graphic design for visuals and stuff like that. I manage the whole kitchen. I'm like the head chef. So I've got a bunch of people who do, all the great work and they're experts in their field. And I kind of run around with a spoon and stick it in their stuff and taste it. And I'm like, okay, this seems great. And then when it all comes together, ideally, we get a really fantastic end product that has a cohesive vision and will be very successful in the market and players will love it and all of that good stuff. So that's effectively what I do. I get to have my finger in all the pies.
Awesome. And despite there being many pies, there's one specific pie we're going to focus on today, and that is, of course, Star Wars Shatterpoint, which comes out in June next month, about a month away. People are getting their hands on it. People have had demo time, which we got to demo it at Adepticon. So we've got a bunch of questions, most of which are related to Shatterpoint. We're going to throw at you, and hopefully the kids at home will get some good, juicy tidbits to talk about.
Well, I can't wait for the unexpected bonus round where it has nothing to do with Shatterpoint and everything to do with like high value math computations. And I'll be like, I have no idea.
All right, let's start off with one that has been on my mind since Adepticon, which is
okay, I'm excited.
At Adepticon, at all of the demo tables, I noticed that the playmats that all the demos were on had Star Wars and Atomic Mass Games branding, and I want to know, are those specifically in-house tools for your demo team, or are those products that we can expect to see on store shelves sometime in the future?
So those game mats were specifically made by us for events and for demos for Star Wars Shatterpoint. Of course, whenever you put the effort into something like that, you always kind of like hope that it'll wind up getting into players' hands more regularly or in some fashion, maybe as a product or something else. But as our purview as a studio within the Asmodee like family, is that all of the accessory stuff, so game mats and those kinds of things, are handled by GameGenic.
Sure.
So if we do see those hit the market, which I can't really speak to because again, it's not necessarily within our zone of influence anymore. They would come out as part of the GameGenic like accessory line for Atomic Mass Games products. So I think odds are pretty good that we'll see that happen, especially if there's interest and there has been a lot of questions asked about those, and I've seen a lot of folks online saying about how they'd love to have some cool Shatterpoint themed game mats. So we'll see, but for right now, yeah, they're mostly just designed from our perspective to take into events and have really cool play surfaces on. But who knows what the future will hold?
Cool,
Nice.
Yeah, I thought those were very cool, and I was like, ooh, because there hasn't been any new Star Wars mats in a while, so I was like, ooh, hopefully we'll talk to the people at GameGenic.
Yeah, there you go. Like start the letter writing campaign now, and we've got files ready for them. Like we'll just start sending them. We'll send them all the cool arts to make game mats out of.
So now that people have been getting demos in and even getting their hands on some early copies and stuff, how is the team feeling about the like reception that you're getting already, kind of the feedback and buzz?
Oh, I mean, I think like everyone's super thrilled. It's been a fun little ride. Obviously we had the big world premiere of the gameplay at Adepticon through the demos. We posted the rule book, so everyone's been like digesting that and tearing away, and then everything keeps getting revealed. Right, like we're in that mode where we're ramping up 1 month away from release, so players have like all the cards from the core set. They're gonna get all of the cards from the Obi-Wan and Dooku packs like really quick coming up. So it's fun to watch people as they kind of work through, their conceptions and their misconceptions in some ways of
Mhm.
what the game is and what it will be, especially because you start with kind of the drip feed of information and you don't give them the whole picture to make sure that everyone's engaged. You want that conversation and that dialogue. But I think, internally we couldn't be more pleased than anything because you just all the excitement, all of the discussion happening, the dialogue, like all the conversations are nonstop, and I think there's a really healthy discourse around the game. And obviously, there's pros and there's cons, and there's people who say positive things, there's people who say negative things. The fact of the matter is that if you care enough to engage and to debate and to discuss, that's a great sign, right?
Yeah.
And of
Sure.
course, it's even better when the positivity and the excitement kind of win out, and you see people be like, well, maybe I don't like this part of it, or maybe I think this rule could have been done differently, but overall, it hasn't dulled my enthusiasm for the game. Right? I will deal with it. That's kind of the best gamer compliment you can get after doing this for so long. Is somebody being like, I will accept this, but I won't like it because I want to play the game. And you're like, okay, well then the rest of the game is obviously doing something that's exciting and enticing to you.
And it's got to be hard when people are forming opinions before they even have it. But I'll say anecdotally, it seems like it's mostly hype, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, honestly, I used to be marketing director in my previous experience at within the industry and stuff, and you kind of do that to yourself on purpose because it's the same with movies, right? Any kind of teaser or trailer kind of system where you're trying to drum up excitement and enthusiasm and conversation. You go back to that statement of there's no such thing as bad PR in a way, and that you just want people to talk about it. You want them to wonder and have anticipation and everything. So you kind of, when they don't have the full picture and people are conjecturing or making guesses or, making determinations based on their limited sets of information, you go, yes, this is exactly was the plan. And you hope that what you're giving them is exciting enough that when more of the picture is revealed, right, they're along with you for the ride. It's like a great murder mystery novel in a way. That you're convinced that the butler did it, and then all of a sudden more information comes that kind of shatters your preconceived notions. And if the narrative is well told, once your original thesis is thrown to the wind because of new information that you had no way to know because the author hadn't told you about it yet, you take it with excitement and anticipation rather than being like, well, this is dumb, it doesn't even make sense anymore, right? So there's a lot of care and thought given into how that drip feed happens, what you do when, and so yeah, it's exciting to see that pay off, and it's fun to go on that ride. And I think I've done this enough, and a lot of us internally have been part of the industry long enough that we kind of understand how the roller coaster works. It's like, oh, they're going to get really excited here. Oh, they're going to get really frustrated here because they don't have it yet. And then we're going to show it to them, and we're going to go back up that high, right? It's a lot of ups and downs and loopsy loops. And then you get to the final end of the ride and the game goes in people's hands. And then the excitement really starts.
All right. So where does you or the team, and maybe what is the perception of the audience at this point, where Shatterpoint should fit as far as a competitive game, a kitchen table game, somewhere in between? What is the kind of the vibe that you're going for, or maybe what people think it is?
I think when it comes to games in general, but especially tabletop miniatures games or lifestyle games, right? A well-developed and designed game is kind of like the cave at Dagobah. It contains whatever the person who comes to it has with them, right? So if you're looking for a high skill level competitive experience where you're interested in going to the stores on weekends and challenging other people in a Swiss bracket, you're going to find that. Whether we intended that to be there or not, it's going to be there because you can play that way. If you're looking for just a madcap narrative experience that you're going to play with your friends and you want to tell your Star Wars stories and make pew pew noises and flip your miniatures around when they're doing their force jumps and stuff, and have more of that kitchen table experience, that it's there too, right? I think the important thing from a design and development end is that great games are balanced and written in a way that allows players to experience what they want out of them without an overemphasis on one or the other, right? I think the trap is when you say, "Oh, well, it's just a casual game. We don't have to worry about tight rules, or we don't have to worry about internal balance." You're going to run into problems because you're going to create situations that break the fun, right? You can say all day that casual players don't care about rules, but they actually care about rules way more than a competitive player does, because a casual player is not interested in putting in the work to figure out when an interaction doesn't work, right? They're there for the story and the experience. When I sit down at the table, I want to have an engaging, fun time with my friends. And the point at which we run into a situation that we cannot define or explain, and we have to go to that dreaded rule book, is the point at which we stop having fun. And if I have to do that more than a couple of times, especially the more and more I play the game and the more I think I've understood the game, the more likely I am to just be like, this game is not for me. It's not delivering the experience I want. Now, a competitive player, because they're very involved with the rules and they're looking for efficiencies and they're looking for, loopholes, quote unquote, they're trying to maximize their ability to play within the system that's given to them. They have less of an aversion to say, okay, well, I don't entirely know how this rule works. Like, let's debate it. Let's go to the rules forum. Let's go to the rule book. Let's see how this goes. So they'll accept things that a casual player, quote unquote casual, and I'm using these terms like they're definitive, and they're really not. But it's an easy way to kind of like bookend the spectrum that we often talk about, whether it's in conversations like this or online and all of this stuff, like what is a game. But they'll be willing to like work through rules conundrums and vagaries. But what they will quickly do is they'll find the most efficient things. They'll put those efficient things together and they will form their system that says, this is how we win. And if that system becomes the only, like if the system that somebody discovers, the only way to beat that system is to use the same system, right? So I can only beat Anakin if I have Anakin Skywalker. That's when their fun is removed, right? Because the competitive player, the person who plays in the tournament, they want their skill to matter, but they also want their ingenuity to matter. They want to be able to like dive into the numbers and see the matrix and pull all those things together. Whereas a casual player may not care as much about that, but they still want their characters to function the way they should. They still want to feel like the game is engaging and not one-sided and all that stuff. So really what it comes down to is every player is going to bring their own wants and desires to it. The experience that we want to give people is an entertaining, fun, and engaging Star Wars game that focuses on the characters. That means that our goal is to write clear, concise rules, and also to maintain a very tight balance curve that says all of these characters are basically viable within a certain level of player skill, right? It's not a perfectly balanced game. In fact, perfectly balanced is literally the worst thing that we could ever do as a studio, because if we make everything perfectly balanced, it means literally you get one thing and it's always the same thing. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants Hondo Anaka and Count Dooku to be the exact same character. Like, that's not the experience that you came for. It's not the experience that any of us wants to live. People will claim that they want perfect balance, but they don't understand what that means. And perfect balance means that everything is literally identical. There's one stat to rule them all.
Like chess.
Instead, what we're really looking for is a tight balance curve where it says there's always going to be things on the bottom. There's always going to be things on the bottom end, like the less efficient things. There's always going to be the most efficient things. But how do you keep those two ends as close as possible? And determining how close that curve should be and all that stuff, those are developer and designer choices that get made all the time by different companies. Some companies have some designers have a big band that they think is okay, and some designers have a very tight band. We live more on the tight band of the spectrum, but we also know that, there's going to be things that fall left or right. And that's okay. It's healthy. In fact, what you want to do is make sure that nothing really breaks the curve, because the other thing that you can do is you can go back in and you can adjust where those things fall by adding new releases that boost something or that counter something. If you're always thinking about it in terms of an organic system that's ever growing, then it's your job to kind of get ahead of it and identify things that you want it to grow. It's kind of like, gardening or bonsai, right? You're going to trim certain branches to get a shape out of the tree. You're also going to let nature like make the tree beautiful too. You don't want to just go in and force it into your own system, because you're probably going to kill it. So there's a give and a take. There's a lot of consideration and care given to that. the end of the day, the real answer is, I think players will do with this game what they want. I am fully confident that there's going to be a group of players that are going to base their entire enjoyment and like drive around this game based on skill and trying to maximize, their abilities and their path to victory through the randomness that the game provides. I do think that Shatterpoint offers some unique challenges and a lack of perfect information and control that we really haven't seen in many miniatures games. And therefore, the people who really want to play this game competitively will probably be very different from the people who play other miniatures games competitively. Because a lot of the turn zero stuff, in fact, the vast majority of the turn zero stuff that, a game like Star Wars Legion or Star Wars X-Wing really incentivizes if you want to go play competitively, Shatterpoint doesn't have. Because you can say, okay, I've built my perfect squad and my perfect strike team, and this is the exact activation order that needs to happen so I can maximize all my synergies. And then I say, okay, we'll shuffle your order deck, and you go, crap. Like,
yeah,
the game skill and the questions that it asks you are not at turn 0. It's more at turn 1, 2, 3, 4, and on, right? And I think it's gonna be interesting to watch as that meta and that kind of like player skill develops and how players approach it, who is good at it, it may not be for them, right? Not every game is for every person, no matter how much we'd love it if that was the case. We all are attracted to different things. And then from the casual side, the quote unquote casual side, I think, we've done our best to make sure that the game it runs really smooth. There are very few questions. It gives you the experience that is promised on the box, which is super dramatic, high kinetic, high energy, action-packed, like character-focused combat in the Star Wars galaxy. And you can kind of live your Star Wars storytelling dreams in it because you can mix and match characters and all this other stuff. And so in the end, right, if we've done our job super well, then I think that Shatterpoint can deliver on all the levels that players want it to deliver. And the hope is that will be a true statement because that's what we want, right? I never want to create a game that blocks out some group or another. One, it's not good business. And two, it's just disappointing because we're in this, everyone at AMG and myself especially, we're in this because we want to create situations where players get to have fun, specifically with each other, right? Like being able to connect across a table with other people and get lost in the experience, to tell your story, to have your dramatic moments, whether that's from a narrative perspective or from a gameplay perspective. Those are all the things that, to me, are the reason that I keep coming back to these games after 32 plus years now, because I'm getting really old. That's the community building part. It's the reason that I keep doing it. It's the reason that I want to continue on. And I think everyone at AMG kind of has the same kind of story, right? And you guys as well. I have no doubt. Why do you take time out of your personal days to do a podcast and be community builders? It's because we found that magic, and that's why people travel across the country to go to an Adepticon or a UK Games Expo or whatever, to meet with people that they only see once a year and have an amazing time, because these games connect us in ways that other things don't. So, that at the end of the day, that's the goal. How do you make a game that delivers on its expectation and its promise and can do so in many ways? Like even that competitive player, ideally they're enjoying the game, not because it's also challenging their skill, but also because they're doing so in an environment that feels like they're telling Star Wars stories, right? Like they're piloting Anakin to victory. They're defeating Lord Maul in combat through their clever application of the rules and everything else. And so, it's always funny when people try to bucket things as this or that. And it's like, well, from my perspective, right, from AMG's perspective, and this is true for Michael Plummer, who's the lead developer, Will Pagani, Dallas Kemp, who's our creative director, like everyone within the studio, we don't look at games as to, are they competitive or are they casual? It's simply, what's the experience and how does that experience translate to the widest group of people possible?
Awesome. Fantastic.
A little more on the balance question that got me thinking too. I imagine a lot of the design choices do make a big difference on how easy it is to balance in some ways. Like you don't have all the upgrade cards that you would for like X-Wing or Legion, where like a new upgrade card now gets used on an old unit, and there's like a bunch of weird combos because you have so many things combining, right? So like that, keeping that scope a little more narrow probably helps a lot of that too, right?
Yeah, there's certainly, I mean, there's always a complexity budget. And then there's the question of like, okay, as you move forward and into the future, what do you have to deal with? Like, what did past you do to future you, right?
Yeah.
And you do want to think about that stuff. And I think, well, obviously you can approach it many ways. One of the things that's been most interesting from the balance perspective of Shatterpoint is we still have a lot of, there's the tag system, which is in there, which means that, you do have to be aware that when you release a character that says at the start of this character's activation, a Galactic Republic character can dash and gain a hunker token. Like Captain Rex has to be considered for anyone who has that tag forever and ever, right? Because he will always have that ability and they will always be able to benefit from him. So you do wind up in the situation where, the things that you do now, you're always thinking about in the future. And one of the fun challenges, because it is a fun challenge because it's a thought exercise, is that as you develop this stuff, you look at it and you say, okay, well, what is this cut off in the future? What can we never do? Is one of the first questions that always comes up when you're like, I have this idea for this really awesome ability. And then the conversation quickly goes to, that is really neat. What does it mean we can never do?
As long as we never, yeah.
Yeah, we can never make a character that has more than nine dice on attack for Galactic Republic if we do this, right? Or whatever it is. And you try to anticipate those things. And a lot of the times, if you can catch most of them, you won't catch all of them. But one of the things with Shatterpoint that makes it really unique, and honestly, one of the more fun things to design characters for, is the fact that because players don't have perfect control over their activation, you actually get to push character power levels in a way that you can't in any other game. Because the interesting thing when you're looking at balance for Shatterpoint is the fact that, like, when you compare it to a Legion or Star Wars X-Wing or a Marvel Crisis Protocol, where players have control over their activation and they can plan around it and they can build perfect synergies. Your opponent is always like, the role of your opponent in those games is to stop your synergies, right? Like, realize what your opponent is trying to do and then put enough pressure on them that you ruin their plan or make them rethink their plan so they can't pull off their perfect machine. Well, Shatterpoint's order deck already does that. There's no guarantee that you're going to get the perfect combination. In fact, it's highly unlikely. So you get to, in this weird way, push characters to power levels that normally would just be busted in other games. You can get away with combinations or abilities on characters knowing that they can't combo as reliably and efficiently because that deck dictates when you get to activate things. And that doesn't mean that you have free reign, right? There's obviously things where it's just like, this is too much. This is overtuned. We need to bring this down. You go back to that thing we were talking about where it's like, okay, what can we never do in the future? But the fact of the matter is that if somebody out there was crazy enough and wanted to have probably a not very great experience for their opponent or themselves, depending on who got their combo off first, if you removed the order deck and played Shatterpoint like a normal game, you'd be like, oh my gosh, so many of these things are broken. And they're broken because you can maximize them, right? But because you can't maximize them, now all of a sudden you have this like buffer where you can push characters and their power levels further than you could otherwise. Because when they come up in perfect synergy, it's like, oh my gosh, that was really good. This is amazing. But it's like a rare occurrence, right?
It's such it almost reminds me of, not like a lot of dice moments in games where like, I absolutely need this to happen, but it's completely up to chance. Or like in Imperial Assault, when you would roll the super dodge and everybody at the table goes, oh my God, I can't believe that just happened. Like, now that happens with, okay, now I got to combo Anakin back to back with Ahsoka or whatever. And now I get to do the super move that we didn't know was going to come up or not.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting and fun, like right now, there's been a lot of discussion about Django. People are starting to see his card from the Dooku pack and they're having a lot of discussions. And like in any other game, that Django card probably wouldn't be okay. But the fact of the matter, especially like at his level and at his points cost and all this, but once you start getting a feel for the game and playing the game and realizing that, Django doesn't get to do all the stuff he wants to do, and he doesn't get to do it at the time that he wants or the time that you want him to do it, right? And the innate power that's on the card becomes mitigated by the fact that there is a randomized order deck that you have very little control over. Also, that your opponent doesn't have control over their stuff. And then you throw in all of like the board manipulation that's just baked into every Shatterpoint character, all the shoves, all the repositions, all the out of activation movements and things, right? So even if the world is your oyster and you get everything that you wanted for your perfect turn zero plan that you can't execute reliably in Shatterpoint, the likelihood that everything's still going to be in place by the time you get around to that is unlikely as well, because your opponent's going to pull, they're going to pull a secondary character with a tactic. And all of a sudden the person who was perfectly placed because you used Asajj's force push to get them in range of Django, who was going to capture wire them and then start, shooting them to the ends of the earth. Like, all of a sudden that character just moves because, Kalani Rogers that droid, and it just walks away and you're like, no. So it's a fun challenge, and it's been really fun to work on because it is very different. It requires a different kind of thought process from a design and development standpoint. And I'm excited to see how all of that translates into how players approach the game. And going back to our conversation before, right? Like, what is the competitive meta that develops around it? How do players approach these unique challenges in some ways because of the innovations I think we were able to make on the game and how it works within stuff? And then also, what do players see that we don't? Because at the end of the day, we've been working on this game for 3+ years now, but we can never, no matter how hard we try, replicate the sheer number of games and the sheer diversity of thought, honestly, that this game will have within the first 4 to 6 months, right? Maybe even the first 3 months.
Yeah, I'm very curious about what you were saying with the competitive style players, because most competitive players do everything they can to mitigate randomness and chance, whether that's with dice or order activation and whatever. And since that's just something, because there's also, I've noticed, very little ability to re-roll dice in Shatterpoint. I think that is going to attract a very different type of high level player, if you want to call them that, or whatever. I'm very curious to see how that shakes out, because I think I'm end up on both sides of the spectrum on all of those games where I'm like, yeah, I like to go to League. I ended up playing in Legion Worlds, but also I just want to play with little Star Wars guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I think that's why for me, whenever somebody like buckets somebody as one or the other, it's like, not really. We all have different mixes, right? Like, I've never met a player, and this includes our lead developer Pagani, who was a professional gamer for some time. Like, he was a professional tabletop gamer. He did Magic the Gathering professional circuit. He did, miniatures games. Like, he went to Worlds events and won them multiple times for many miniatures games. He lived that life. And even he, at his height, when he was practicing 8 hours a day after work every day of the week to be able to win those high level competitions, was still playing on the side for fun. He was still throwing together lists that were just janky and weird. And, he had favorite characters in all those games or favorite moments. And so your biggest slice of your pie might be, I like the skill and the competition involved, but you're also here because you like Star Wars, right? You like the setting and the galaxy and something about it like inspires you. Something about, the play of the game inspires you. And so that's why I think, the idea that there are competitive players in their cat, it's not true. I've also never met a casual player who wasn't excited to win a game, right? Like, they might not get as upset when they lose. They're not a Wookiee. They're not going to pull your arms out of their sockets. But like, they also don't go, oh, I can't believe I won. This was the worst experience ever. I was just here for the story.
I have one friend who's like that. I'll tell you what. He's gonna feel real bad. He's gonna be mad at me for calling him out. But that's only because he's really, really good at all games, which rubs off on everybody else. Like, there he goes again. And so he tends to feel bad when he wins 10 times in a row because he's just really good. But he's a very nice guy, so it makes him feel bad that he makes us feel bad. But he's so good and competitive and casual that he feels bad for beating us so badly all the time.
All right. Well, there you go. I mean, I think he's still probably internally, he's still probably like, well, I'm happy that I won, but I'm also sad that I made somebody lose. Like being excited that you won, but also sad that somebody had to lose, I think is a valid, it's a valid stance as well.
We just
But
need
yeah,
a game that both people can win. And
every game is a tie.
Every game is a tie. Yes.
Let's see. You mentioned that part of the kind of the something that might appeal to people about Shatterpoint is being able to mix and match and make your little dream teams with characters that wouldn't normally interact with each other. And I found that to be interesting. One, I want to know how did that decision get arrived at where you can have, Anakin Skywalker, or you can have Obi-Wan and Darth Maul working together. Whereas pretty much every other Star Wars game I can think of doesn't let you do that. And additionally, was there anything you had to convince LucasFilm of to let you get away with that?
Well, so I'll answer the second part first because it's pretty quick. LFL was all on board. Their primary question was, can you play canonically? Does the game allow you to play straight out of Star Wars? And the answer was, well, of course it does. And then they're like, great. Everything else sounds like wonderful player choice. They're very well, Lucasfilm is very focused on the continuity and the integrity of the Star Wars galaxy and its mythos and everything, its mythology, its stories that have been told. They also, I think, have a really good recognition of the fact that part of what makes, Star Wars and other fandoms like it, but Star Wars especially, so wonderful, so strong, so compelling to people is that it provides a sandbox that players and, people in general, fans in general get to play in, right? They would never stop somebody coming to Star Wars Celebration in their fan-made Mandalorian costume, right? They would never stop a player or an attendee from coming in dressed as their own unique Jedi, right? Those are things they celebrate, in fact, because you are showing the passion and the creativity to be part of the galaxy. Now, they're probably not going to put you in the next Star Wars encyclopedia, but that is different from the continuity is different from the engagement with the IP and the galaxy itself. And I think that's very cool. So, when we were talking to them about Shatterpoint, the goal was, we wanted to do a micro-focused character-driven skirmish game that was set in the Star Wars galaxy. And we wanted to give players the opportunity to tell stories that have never been told before. And part of that is, once you start talking about characters and the identity and the relationship to characters, I think for me, as somebody who's been a fan of Star Wars forever, my character likes the people that I want to paint and have on the shelf and be able to play with. They don't all align, right? I love Cad Bane. He's one of my favorite characters. Ever since his introduction in the Clone Wars, I think he's incredible.
But at the same, anytime Cad Bane pops up in anything, everybody texts me and they're like, "Joe, did you see that? Are you okay?"
Yeah, because he's a fantastic character. He just speaks to me on so many levels. At the same time, though, I have always loved Luke Skywalker, right? Watched the original trilogy. He was the guy I wanted to be. I wanted to be the Jedi, the farm boy who got taken off the planet and got the magical lightsaber sword and got to save the galaxy, right? To be the hero. So the idea that, artificially, I can't take Luke and I can't take Cad Bane and tell my story, right? I look a lot at tabletop miniatures games as kind of an adult reflection of the act of playing with action figures as a kid, right? Of playing with toys that
I tell that to a lot of my friends where they collect action figures and I'm like, well, I've got to save this money for the toys that I actually get to play with.
Yeah, what if you could play with them and have some structure to it?
Yeah, but you think about, they're very similar, right? No one stopped. In fact, when you go look at the old commercials, right? All the things the kids are doing on the commercials with their sweet action figures and their new play sets, they're reminiscent of the movies from which they're drawn, but they're not telling those stories. They're telling their own stories. And that's what I think that's the magic that makes you, or made me as a kid. Like, I loved action figures. I would sit in my room for hours and just play and tell my own stories and do my own thing. And I think, the reason that I got so into miniatures games is because that element was also there. Like, there's the physical, tactile thing of having this miniature that is somewhat like action figure-esque, but also involves your personal hobby and putting it together and painting it. It takes that whole experience from childhood and takes it to the next level. And so Shatterpoint, right? Just like we did with Marvel Crisis Protocol, we want players, like, I want players to be able to engage with it and tell their own stories, to make their miniatures collections a piece of their own Star Wars like mythology. And when it comes to a character driven game, you have so much freedom, I think, that it's silly to be like, well, everything's bucketed behind a faction. It's like, why? Because you can't tell. And then people are like, well, because those people never met up in the stories. Like, we never saw these two work together. Cad Bane and Luke Skywalker never met. I'm like, okay, well, they haven't met yet because somebody from LFL hasn't written that story. Like, you can't, when it comes to a galaxy that's as wide and as open, as sandboxy as Star Wars, you can't really stand on the leg of, well, this would never happen. I mean, we even have the place between worlds where time travel, like warping between the different like time, is maybe possible if somebody wants to write it that way. Like, there is no story that can't be written. It just hasn't been written. And that's not to say that you as the player, once you write it, it's canonical, but it's your story and you get to tell that with your opponent. So, like, let people tell their stories, let them have the freedom to do that, as long as you can make a game experience that is, interesting and compelling and balanced for it. And I think that, that comes back again to, what game are you making? Like, what's the experience, right? As much as I love the fact that you can mix and match and you can play your favorite characters in Shatterpoint, it only works because Shatterpoint is designed around the character. We're telling personal stories. And so the game can be balanced around that. Like, with a game like Legion, however, where there's much more focus on the organic whole, the army itself, you can't get away with that, right? It doesn't really fit within the IP. There's not as much, like, there's even not as much narrative, creative grounding to it. And from a game design and development standpoint, it causes a lot of problems. You're just not going to make a great game if you do that. It's going to be too mishmashy. And you're going to wind up in a place where, like, everything just looks weird and wrong. But from a Shatterpoint perspective, like, again, it might be a little jarring to see Darth Vader with General Obi-Wan, right? But then at the same time, it's pretty easy to say, well, like, if you really want to justify it, Darth Vader existed in the Clone Wars, and Jedi Knight Obi-Wan, or Jedi General Obi-Wan Kenobi, decided to join the Empire, and I've painted him in Empire colors, and this is what we have. Or the flip side is, they had their battle on Mustafar. Darth Vader or Anakin Skywalker awoke to find out that he was Darth Vader, realized that Padme was dead, blamed Emperor Palpatine, killed him, and, like, had a redemption arc. And so now he's working again to, like, restore peace and order to the galaxy with his best bud Obi-Wan. Like, he repented. Right? Like, any of these stories could be true. And honestly, like, if your story is just, I like these characters, leave me alone, what of it? Then that's a fine story too. Like, you don't have to justify what you are doing from a perspective of fun within the game itself. But yeah, so I mean, like, it's really, I think it's really satisfying and great to go back and hearken to those places where, like, you can give as much choice and flexibility and freedom to the players as possible. And the other thing that it does from, like, the not narrative perspective, but the game perspective, is it says, okay, now players have so much more freedom to be innovative, to say, okay, I don't care about any of these characters. I'm just going to look at the raw efficiencies of the rules. Instead of being locked behind, a faction, you now have all these extra, like, free radicals that you can pull in. You can say, okay, I don't just have to worry about dark side characters. I can look at the light side characters. I can look at the mercenaries, and I can start to, like, pull all these different things together. So the puzzle becomes bigger. The opportunities to innovate become bigger. Like, right? Like, your spice rack just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that's also really exciting and fun from just a player perspective and what the game experience is offering to you. So it's a lot of different reasons, right? But I think at the end of the day, It's you have the opportunity to do it with a game like this. And for me, the reasons not to do it, there aren't very many, and I don't think those arguments are very strong compared to the reasons to do it.
A little more on working with Lucasfilm too. Is it not to get you to talk bad about people or anything, but is it do they push back a lot on Shatterpoint things? I imagine they don't really want to get in the weeds on like rules stuff, but like is it hard to work with a licensor like that, or does it kind of work out pretty organically,
I think so. I think it really depends. Is it hard to work with licensors or not? Honestly, I think it really depends on the person who is working with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you approach it from a standpoint of like, I know what I'm doing and we will do it my way and I will not listen to anyone else, right? If you approach it from a very non-collaborative aspect, you're probably going to have a rough time, right? But if you recognize that you're in it together and that there's a collaboration that's going on, I find the relationship with Lucasfilm to be insanely valuable because they have a knowledge and an understanding of Star Wars and kind of what they, as an entity that is the stewards and protectors, the end all be all of this amazing like galaxy. They have insight and they have reasons for what they do. And sometimes I may not agree with those reasons, right? Like who does when you're in a team environment? But every pushback, everything with them is not a no, it's a no but, right? Or it's a no because. There's always a conversation to be had. And I think, all unlimited creative freedom is never a good thing in my mind. Like when they're just like, do whatever you want, free reign. I think you wind up with like worse stuff. I think working within constraints and having to creatively problem solve around hard no's is where you get really great stuff. Like it's the reason that I think Shatterpoint is as good as it is, because if somebody had just been like, make whatever you want, Shick, it doesn't matter, it wouldn't be as good because I would just be like, do this and do that and do whatever, right? But I have a Pagani who comes in and says, well, you can't do that. And I'm like, why? And he's like, because the rules have to be written in this way. And then we have play testers who come in and they say, well, this doesn't work. And we're like, why? And they're like, well, because it feels unbalanced to this, or it seems too strong to this, right? Like at every step of the process, there are people saying no. But those no's then become opportunities to say, okay, well, how do we work around this? And there are times where, sometimes you come in and you're like, I don't know what to do here, right? Like we're thinking of doing this, but they're always like, LFL is always a great resource to be like, well, we're thinking of this, or we want to do this character, but we don't really know like where should we go for this thing? And they'll offer suggestions. They know their stuff very well. And they'll be like, well, have you thought about this? What about this? Hey, there's this Obi-Wan show that we can't tell you a lot about, but is coming up and might be interesting for this game that you're working on. Right. So
that's
you establish
be really hard too, though. Like, something unreleased, but also got to be very exciting too, of course.
It's I mean, again, it's one of those like big challenges where it's like, okay, you kind of go, I know enough about the characters and they can usually give you enough about like where things are going, even if it's general, that you can come up with stuff. Right. It's a lot harder with like completely brand new characters, right? If you were just to say, hey, why don't you do these Bad Batch guys before we'd ever seen them, even in like season 7, it'd be like, okay, well, they're these weird clones and each of them has a special like ability and they do things. And I'd be like, okay, well, you can still make it, but it wouldn't be as compelling. But when you say, hey, we're going to do an Obi-Wan show, it takes place between, episode 3 and episode 4. And it's about Darth Vader and Obi-Wan, and hey, they have this meeting, like they're going to meet again. I go, okay, I pretty much know how to handle this, even if I don't know the specifics, right? I know the characters, and we know kind of where we're going. We have enough information. But yes.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but like in the end, right? Working with LFL, I think, has been extremely fulfilling. And yeah, we don't always see eye to eye on things, but that's what happens in a team environment. The great thing about it is that we get to work together to solve those problems. And I think what we wind up with is almost always better than what we would have had if we hadn't kind of like had the little collaborative conversation of the no's and the buts, right?
You made me think of something just now that I want to ask is, how, and I figure it's maybe a mix of the two, but do you go, let's do this character and then we'll figure out which abilities are thematically appropriate for this character? Or do you start by saying, I really wish we had a character that could do this. Let's go find somebody from the, encyclopedia that would fit this ability. Like, what comes first, the ability or the character?
So, from the way that I design things and approach them, and of course, this is like my answer, it's not necessarily the right answer, but this has become kind of the AMG way of doing things as well. And that's partially because I think the reason that the team is what it is and the reason we work so well and we're definitely on the same levels, we have similar approaches, right? So the philosophy I think is largely shared, is that you start with the flavor and then you figure out the rules. Um, and so it's like, especially when it comes to character driven skirmish games, the character is so important, is so central. I think you can just kind of realize immediately when something was made for the rule and not for the character. Because you can, you can add a pithy like ability name to any rule and be like, yeah, it's that. But I think we as fans, as players of games, right, you can very quickly like identify this is just there because they needed a thing to be there, versus, oh, this ability was definitely written with this flavor in mind, with this name in mind, that kind of stuff. So we always like to start with the character first, and then we drill down into, okay, well, what does the character do, and how do they apply that? And sometimes, you do say, hey, this character does what we need, right? Some like, because they're not mutually exclusive questions. Like a lot of the times you can say, well, we've identified this gap or this thing that would be cool. And then you can look at your characters and say, well, this character fills it. Let's bump them up the schedule. Let's move this thing here, right? Because there's always some flexibility. Like we do 5-year plans effectively because we work so far ahead of time. But that doesn't mean that we're locked in, right? Like once the 5-year plan is approved, it doesn't mean that it can't change and there's not some organic shifting and things that happen. So you can approach it that way and you can kind of look at things. Really though, like what I found is that if you give players enough of a variety, and that's part of like the identification when it comes to which characters you're going to do when, and you kind of have in the back of your mind, okay, I know what this character does, I know what that character can do, I know where we're going. You balance that plan or that release schedule around those different things that those characters do, and then you naturally kind of wind up in a better spot where you don't have to react as much. But it is very much we're going to do these characters in this fashion, and then we're going to write rules that feel appropriate to what the character does on screen. And we don't typically write a rule and say, oh, this rule would be amazing, we should assign it to this guy just because it's great. There are times where we get to a point where it's like, this rule is really cool, but it's not working because the other abilities are important, or it's like imbalanced with the suite, the entire like stat card and stuff. And we'll save those things for the future for another character that makes sense, or another character that could have that ability. And then we'll slap that on the character. So we can kind of like benefit from current design and future design and dev. And that's fun when it happens. But those times are rarer than just being like, okay, we're on this character, let's do it.
A little more on the release cadence too. I think we know kind of the dates of like the first wave or two or whatever, but do you see it being more like Crisis Protocol style or more Legion style, like bigger, less frequent waves, or more frequent small waves, and like balance between factions and eras and stuff like that as far as the number of releases? Or
so yeah, so I mean, obviously the first like 6 months ish, it's going to be pretty robust, right? And I think that's important because, games like this, and again, talking about, what excites us as players and what interests us and how do you build community, it's like having a lot of things, a lot of options, a lot of opportunities to innovate and explore the game and really see what it can offer and get people excited about that is really important, right? You don't want to just drop the core set and be like, all right, we'll see you in 6 months and then we'll put something else out, right? It's just with how much we engage with these games, because they're lifestyle games, right? It's not like a board game where you pull it out on game night, you play it for a couple hours, and then you put it away and you don't think about it again until next board game night, maybe. And next board game night, you might just think about it and, oh yeah, we played that last week or last time, so we won't play it this time. Tabletop miniatures games as lifestyle games are so exciting because we're always thinking about them, right? Like, we're gonna get done with this interview and I guarantee you guys are probably going to like think about some of the things we talked about or some of the cards, or like you'll go to a different game that you're engaged in. Maybe it's Legion, maybe it's X-Wing, maybe it's Imperial Assault. And you're going to say, how do I pull this stuff together? Like, oh, I want to try this list, right? You get to constantly engage in this hobby. And because of that, it's very important that for a game to be successful and really have a great foundation, it's got to launch strong. And there's got to be a lot of things to think about, because the second that you stop thinking about it, it kind of is sad. And you're like, man, I wish there was something new. I wish there was things. So, the initial release schedule is front loaded in order to do that, in order to really set the foundation of the game. And that's not tenable, right? You can't keep just dumping things out, because there are a finite number of characters, even if that finite number is very, very big. And, we as players can only absorb so much, and you want to be able to play with your stuff and all of that. So moving forward, right, the cadence will look a lot more like Crisis Protocol, and will be balanced with the other lines. And that's going to be true of everything, right? Our ultimate goal with the games is, especially the tabletop hobby miniatures games, Legion, Crisis Protocol, and Shatterpoint, is to have that like sweet cadence of, you're going to consistently see new releases. It's not going to be overwhelming, but it's going to be enough to keep everything like fresh and flowing. And there's not going to be a big delay between like waves, right? And to balance that across like all of the product lines, to make sure that I always go back to like talking about value. And you want every release to have value. You don't want to just release things to release things, because players will quickly figure that out and they'll be like, well, this doesn't really matter. Having a new thing that doesn't do anything is not really any better than not having a new thing at all. So it's our goal to make sure that everything that we put out for each game it has a lot of value to players, and it adds something to the experience, and it's meaningful and useful and all of that stuff. And I think with like, especially because we're engaging with this stuff with hobby and assembling it and painting it and all of that, there's that question too, right? Like if I love painting Star Wars miniatures and I run out of Star Wars miniatures, then I'm going to be like, oh, what am I supposed to do with myself? And all that's to say is like, there will be a steady cadence. I think the Crisis Protocol cadence has worked very well for that game and what it's offering and how players engage with it. And so I would expect that we'll see that it'll mirror to some extent that, and that there will be a kind of an equilibrium that we will hit with all the product lines as we move forward, to make sure that value is being represented, and each game is being taken care of in the best way possible, based on all of the multitude of factors that go into it. And each one's kind of a unique case. For instance, in Shatterpoint and in Crisis Protocol, a player doesn't have to paint 5 Obi-Wans, right? You get the Obi-Wan pack, and then it's like, I've painted this, I can't take more of them, I'm done. But in a game like Legion, it's like when a unit comes out, you might need 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 maybe of that thing. So the release, takes more of your bandwidth. It takes more time. It offers more in terms of that value. So how do you balance those out? And that's part of the, non-flashy portion of my job and my role as development manager or director of product development. That's it. See, I can't even remember my own title. That's how bad it is. Is to analyze each game line and try to figure that out. And then I work with a lot of people at Asmodee and others to like determine that. And it's fun. It's challenging, and sometimes you use a lot of second guessing, but it is one of those things that, a good release cadence makes for an even better game and a growing community.
do 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 do. Ah.